After 3 years of living in my house, my daughter's husband came into a large settlement from his lawsuit. That same afternoon, he told me it was time I thought about transitioning somewhere more suitable for a woman my age. I smiled and said, "Marcus, before we talk about that, did you ever actually read the deed to this house?" Good day, dear listeners. It's Emma. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Please like this video and stay with me until the very end. And when you're done, leave me a comment and let me know what city you're listening from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. I used to believe that the house you build a life in carries something of the people who lived there, not in a ghostly way, but in the way that a room holds light differently, depending on which windows you've opened over the years. I still believe that. What I no longer believe is that everyone under your roof feels it the same way you do. My name is Dorothy Haynes. Most people call me Dot. I am 63 years old, a retired librarian, and for 27 years I lived in the same pale blue colonial on Sycamore Lane in Mill Haven, Tennessee. My husband, Robert, installed the built-in bookshelves in the living room the summer before our daughter was born. He chose the wood himself, drove 2 hours to a mill in Cookeville because he wanted something that would last. He died of pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2020, and after that it was just me, the house, and the bookshelves full of books we had read together and argued about and recommended to each other for 29 years. I managed well enough on my own for 2 years. I had my pension from the county library system, my garden in the backyard, my friend Beverly from my book club, and enough sense to know the difference between being alone and being lost. They are not the same thing, and confusing them leads to decisions you regret. When my daughter Rachel called in the fall of 2022 and told me that she and her husband Marcus had run into serious financial trouble, I listened carefully. Marcus had been in construction management, and a dispute with a former employer had left him suspended from 2 major contracts while the situation was investigated. Rachel was working part-time as a dental hygienist, but their apartment rent in Nashville was $2,400 a month, and without Marcus's income, they were 3 months behind. I didn't hesitate. "Come stay with me," I said. "We have the whole upstairs, and I genuinely like the company." That was not a mistake. What was a mistake was not understanding what kind of man Marcus Webb was before I extended the invitation. Rachel had always been the quiet one, more like Robert than like me. She tended toward accommodation, toward smoothing things over, toward choosing peace over position even when position was warranted. Robert used to call it her great gift and her great vulnerability, usually in the same sentence. Marcus was 10 years her senior, decisive and self-assured in a way that read as confidence until you spent enough time around him to realize it had no interest in anyone else's perspective. He arrived with opinions already formed about the layout of my kitchen, about the parking angle in the driveway, about the fact that I still kept a physical card catalog index from my old branch library on the shelf in the study, which he called clutter, and I called history. Within the first month, he had rearranged the garage without asking and replaced my welcome mat with one Rachel said he had picked out. It was gray and said home. Robert's mat had been blue with a small heron on it because we had honeymooned near the coast and seen herons every morning from our porch. I put Robert's mat back. Marcus didn't say anything, but I noticed the way he looked at it. By the second year, the small things had accumulated into something harder to ignore. Marcus spoke to me with the particular tone of a man who has decided that older women require a certain kind of patient management. He never raised his voice. He was, in that sense, very controlled. But he referred to my house as the property, as though naming it differently was the first step toward owning it. He began handling the utility bills, which he offered to do and which I allowed because it seemed helpful, but which I later understood had given him a detailed picture of exactly what the house cost and what my pension covered. Rachel said nothing about any of it. I believe she was aware of more than she showed. But she had made her choice when she married Marcus, and she held to it with the same quiet stubbornness that had made her a good student and sometimes a difficult daughter. Then, in the spring of 2024, Marcus's lawsuit finally resolved. A former employer had, it turned out, used a contract manipulation scheme that had affected multiple contractors, and the civil settlement was substantial. I overheard the number on a phone call I was not meant to hear. $840,000, after his portion of the attorney's fees. I did not say anything. I went back to my book, and I thought carefully about what that number would mean for 3 people living in a paid-off house on Sycamore Lane. What it meant, as it turned out, became clear faster than I expected. It was a Wednesday. I remember because I had just come back from the library, where I still volunteered on Wednesday afternoons, helping with the senior reading program. I set my bag down in the entryway, and Marcus was standing in the kitchen in a sport coat I hadn't seen before, which struck me as odd for a Wednesday at home. He told me he had good news about the settlement, and that he and Rachel had been talking about the future. He said it carefully, the way he said most things, as if the words had been considered and arranged in advance. He said that with the settlement, they were in a strong position financially, and they had been thinking that Millhaven was actually a wonderful town to put down real roots. He said they had found a very well-regarded independent living community about 12 minutes away, newer facility, beautiful grounds. He said he and Rachel would be happy to cover the cost, and that the transition would give me, his word, relief from the responsibilities of maintaining a full house at my age. I looked at him across my kitchen, at the counter where I had taught Rachel to make biscuits when she was 8, at the window over the sink that looked out onto Robert's garden, at the hook by the door where Robert's old canvas jacket still hung because I had not been ready to move it. I said, "Marcus, whose name do you think is on that deed?" He paused. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, not the way it does in movies. Just a small recalibration, the look of a man who had expected a different opening move. He said, "Dot, this isn't about ownership. It's about what makes sense for everyone." I said, "I think it's actually entirely about ownership," and sat down at my kitchen table and asked him to please get Rachel. What followed was an hour I will not describe in full because the specific words are less important than their shape. Rachel was apologetic in a way that required Marcus to finish most of her sentences. Marcus was reasonable in a way designed to make resistance seem unreasonable. He spoke about the house needing updates, about the stairs being a risk, about how independent living communities had changed and were nothing like the nursing homes of a previous generation. He used the word transition 4 more times. He did not once use the word deed, which told me he had thought about the deed and decided it was better left unmentioned. I let them finish. Then I said, "I'm not transitioning anywhere. This is my house. My name is the only one on the title, and I would like you both to think carefully before continuing this conversation." Rachel looked at the table. Marcus looked at me with the expression of a man who had been told a problem was solved and was now being informed it wasn't. He said, "Dot, I understand this feels abrupt. We should have had this conversation earlier, and I take responsibility for that. But I want to be honest with you. We have the resources now to build a real life, and this house, as much as we appreciate everything, it limits what that looks like." I said, "What it looks like to me is that you'd like to live in my house without me in it." He didn't answer, which was, in its own way, an answer. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat in the armchair by the window where I used to read to Rachel when she was small. The armchair was old, and the fabric was worn on the right arm, where I always rested my elbow, and I sat in it and let myself feel afraid. I think it's important to be honest about fear, rather than to pretend you stepped through it cleanly. I was 63. I was a widow. My pension was $2,100 a month. The house was paid off and mine, but Marcus had just told me, in the polished language of a man who had prepared for this conversation, that he intended to live in it. I thought about what he had the ability to do. The settlement money was real. Attorneys were real. I had read enough stories, in newspapers, and in the kinds of books librarians read when they want to understand the world, to know that wealth changes the geometry of a dispute even when the law is on your side. He could make my life in this house so uncomfortable that I chose to leave. He could challenge my competency. He could file paperwork I didn't know how to respond to. He could simply outlast me by being younger and better resourced. I sat with those thoughts until they became something I could hold at a distance. Then I got up, went to my desk, and took out a folder I had been keeping for 8 weeks. Here is what I had not told anyone yet. 2 months before the settlement resolved, something Marcus said at dinner had struck me as unusual. He had asked, casually, whether I had ever considered adding Rachel to the house deed, just for estate planning purposes, just to simplify things when the time came. I said I'd think about it. He mentioned it twice more after that, each time framed slightly differently. Once as simplifying the estate, once as protecting Rachel's future. The consistency of the framing was what made me pay attention. Marcus was many things, but he was not a man who said the same thing 3 times by accident. I had not said anything to Rachel. What I had done was call Beverly, and Beverly had given me the name of an elder law attorney in Nashville named Susan Park, who handled exactly these situations. What these situations meant, Beverly explained without drama, was families where one member was trying to position themselves legally before a parent understood what was happening. I had driven to Nashville on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks earlier and spent 2 hours with Susan. She was 58, compact and direct, with the manner of someone who had heard every version of this story and had developed, out of professional necessity, an efficient economy of response. She asked me to describe what had happened in detail, which I did. She then told me 3 things. First, that a verbal suggestion about adding someone to a deed was not a legal commitment, and I had made none. Second, that if Marcus intended to pursue any formal claim on the house, he had no legitimate legal basis for one, but that wealth could create pressure even in the absence of legitimate basis. Third, and this was what made me sit forward in her office chair, she said, "Before we go further, I want you to do something. I want you to get a comprehensive cognitive evaluation from your physician, full documentation. Not because I think there's any question," she said, but because the first strategy in cases like this is often to create one. I understood immediately. She meant that if Marcus decided to challenge my right to manage my own property, the fastest path was to suggest I was no longer capable of making sound decisions. It was the same strategy Christine had threatened in that story a friend had told me, and it is apparently not uncommon. I scheduled the evaluation the following week. I scored well across every category. My physician, Dr. Abernathy, provided a written summary and signed a formal statement of cognitive competency that Susan filed in her records and that I kept a copy of in the folder in my desk. I also, at Susan's recommendation, had sent a certified letter to Marcus and Rachel 3 weeks prior to that Wednesday kitchen conversation, not demanding anything, but establishing in writing that I was the sole owner of the property at 14 Sycamore Lane in Millhaven, Tennessee, that I had no intention of transferring ownership, and that any future communication regarding the property should be directed to my attorney. Marcus had received it. He had said nothing about it. I now understood why he had said nothing. He was waiting to see whether the settlement would arrive before I acted. It had. And so had I. I took out the folder and called Beverly. Beverly Marsh had been my closest friend since we worked the same reference desk in the early 2000s. Before she transferred to the county courthouse branch and spent the next 15 years handling legal research requests. She was 67, drove a sensible sedan, grew pepper plants on her apartment balcony, and had a talent for remaining calm in proportion to exactly how serious a situation was. She answered on the first ring. Her voice was careful. "It happened? It happened." I told her everything. The sport coat, the transition word, the 12-minute drive to the independent living community he'd apparently already looked up. Beverly was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You already called Susan, right?" "I'm about to." "Good. Don't say anything more to either of them tonight. Not one word about what you're planning." She paused. "Can you do that?" I spent 27 years telling children where books were located while they talked over me. I think I can manage one evening. Beverly made a sound that was almost a laugh. Call Susan. Then come for dinner Thursday. Bring nothing. I'll cook. I called Susan that night. She was not surprised. She said the letter we had sent was now critical, because it established that I had been aware of the situation and proactive before any formal pressure was applied. She said that Marcus's strongest theoretical play would be to argue that I had informally agreed to transfer some interest in the property, based on the 3 conversations he'd initiated about adding Rachel to the deed. She said the fact that I had not done so, and that I had documented my refusal in advance through the certified letter, made that argument very difficult. But she also said what she had said before. These cases are not always about law, they're about endurance. He has more money than you. If he decides to create a prolonged dispute, he can. The question is whether the cost of doing so is worth it to him. How do I make it not worth it? I asked. By making the alternative more expensive than the dispute, she said. I have a proposal. Tomorrow I'm going to draft a formal demand, not an eviction notice yet, but a legal document asserting your sole ownership, requesting they vacate the premises within 90 days if they cannot demonstrate legal right to occupy, and outlining the documentation we have. We send it certified mail and email simultaneously. Shouldn't that come after he escalates? She was quiet for a moment. He's already escalating. He just did it quietly. The settlement money changes his position. I want your documentation on the record before he moves to the next step. The next morning, I told Marcus I was visiting an old colleague from my library days, which was true enough that I felt no particular discomfort saying it. He was eating breakfast and looking at his phone, and he nodded in the way of someone who was not listening. Rachel asked if I'd be back for dinner. I said I wasn't sure. I drove to Nashville on the interstate with the radio off, thinking about Robert, about the bookshelves he had built, about the morning he had planted the azalea bushes along the south fence that still bloomed every April without being asked to. Susan had prepared the document overnight. She walked me through each section carefully. She pointed to the cognitive evaluation summary and explained how it preemptively addressed the most likely challenge. She showed me the certified letter receipt as Exhibit A. She then showed me something she had found the night before, something I had not known to look for. A public records search had turned up a consultation between Marcus and a Nashville attorney specializing in real estate and elder estate disputes, dated 5 weeks earlier. The consultation itself was confidential, but the attorney's name was logged in a professional referral database. Marcus had been preparing longer than I realized. Of course he had. We sent the document that afternoon. I drove home on the interstate in the late October light, and I felt something I had not felt in weeks, which was the specific clarity of a person who has stopped waiting for someone else to begin. They were in the living room when I got back, and the atmosphere had the quality of a room in which an argument has recently ended. Marcus looked at me from the couch with an expression I recognized from the library. The expression of a patron who has just been told the book they wanted was checked out, and they considered that a personal affront. Rachel looked at her hands. "We got a letter," Marcus said. "I know." I sat down in Robert's old reading chair, the one Marcus had twice suggested donating to a resale shop. I sat in it and looked at them both. His voice was controlled, but something underneath it wasn't. "You hired an attorney." "Several weeks ago, actually." His jaw tightened. "I want to be very direct with you. We are trying to do right by this family. We offered you a beautiful solution. A new place. Fully paid. Close to town. And instead of having a conversation, you brought lawyers into it." I looked at him. "You brought lawyers into it 5 weeks ago when you consulted a real estate attorney in Nashville," I said. I simply responded. The room went very quiet. Rachel's head came up. "How do you?" Marcus started. "It's a referral database. It's not confidential," I said. "I spent 27 years in a research library, Marcus. I know how to find information." He stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room for a moment, in the way of a man recalibrating in real time. Then he turned around, and the sport coat version of himself was gone. What was there instead was plainer and less rehearsed. You are making this into a fight that doesn't have to be one. His voice was tight. We have the money to handle this properly now. We can give you everything you need. An apartment, a house if you want, wherever you choose. We are trying to be generous. I thought about the word generous. I thought about what it would mean to accept generosity from Marcus Webb and sleep in a bed he had paid for and eat in a kitchen he owned and understand every morning that my continued comfort depended on his continued patience with me. I said, "You asked me 3 times to add Rachel to this deed. I said I'd think about it. I did think about it. And 2 months ago I hired an attorney and sent you a certified letter, which you received and said nothing about. You said nothing because you were waiting for the settlement to arrive so you would have the resources to apply pressure." I looked at him steadily. That's not generosity. That's a strategy. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make this easier. Rachel made a sound that might have been my name. Marcus pointed at me. You are an old woman living alone in a house that is too large for you. And you are letting stubbornness cost you a very comfortable life, because you cannot admit that times have changed. I looked at him for a long moment. I want you to hear what you just said, I said quietly. You told me I was old and alone and stubborn. 2 minutes ago you were telling me you were trying to be generous. Which is it? He left the room. His footsteps on the stairs were hard and fast. Rachel sat very still. She did not look at me for a long moment. When she did, her face had an expression I had last seen when she was 17, and had done something she couldn't quite defend and knew it. Mom, she said. Her voice was thin. I'm sorry. I don't know what to say. I don't need you to say anything right now, I said. I need you to understand that this house is mine, and I am not leaving it, and that whatever happens next happens with that fact at the center. She nodded. Once, small. Then she got up and went upstairs after her husband. I sat alone in Robert's chair for a long time. The house was quiet, and the October dark came in through the windows, and I thought about the specific courage it takes to be 63 and a widow, and to sit in a chair in your own home, and refuse to be managed. It is not a dramatic courage. It does not feel heroic in the moment. It feels mostly like stubbornness and grief, and a very tired version of the word no. I texted Susan to let her know what had happened. She replied, "Good. Stay the course. Don't engage further tonight." I did not sleep particularly well, but I slept in my own bed, in my own room, and in the morning I made my own coffee, and I drank it looking out at the azalea bushes Robert had planted. And that was enough. Beverly had pot roast on Thursday, and a friend with her when I arrived. A woman named Carolyn she'd known since graduate school, who now worked in a social services coordination role for the county. Carolyn was 60, and had, Beverly told me quietly in the kitchen, spent 15 years helping older adults navigate exactly the situation I was in. Not every case, she said over dinner, comes down to who has the law on their side. Sometimes it comes down to who gets tired first. I told them I wasn't planning to get tired. Carolyn listened to everything I described, and then said something I have thought about since. She said, "The move to document your competency early was the right call. That's the lever they pull when the property argument doesn't work. Once you've got a physician's formal assessment on record, it's very expensive to challenge, and courts generally require substantial evidence to override it." She looked at me across Beverly's dinner table. Marcus is smart enough to know that. My guess is he already knows the challenge won't hold. What will he try next? I asked. Carolyn considered this. He'll try negotiation again, she said. He'll come back with a number, either a buyout offer for the house or a revised version of the Florida scenario. She meant something like what he'd already offered. He'll frame it more generously and give you a deadline. And if I don't take it, then it becomes a question of what a civil suit would actually cost him versus what the house is worth to him. She paused. What is the house worth to him? I thought about that honestly. Millhaven had been growing for 3 years. The property values on Sycamore Lane had increased significantly. The house appraised at around $480,000 the previous year, but I did not think the house itself was what Marcus wanted. I thought what Marcus wanted was to win, and I thought the house was the arena he had chosen for that. I think he wants to establish that he makes the decisions, I said. Carolyn nodded slowly. Then the best thing you can do is make sure that's exactly what doesn't happen. She cut her bread. And make sure the people around you know what's going on. Communities notice things. His version of this story depends on you being isolated. I drove home that night feeling something I recognized from my best years at the library, which was the feeling of being seen clearly and not found wanting. They came to me 2 weeks later together and formally, the way people do when they have prepared what they plan to say. Marcus knocked on the door of my study on a Sunday afternoon and asked if we could all sit down. I put my book aside and followed them to the living room. He was dressed plainly, not the sport coat. Rachel sat beside him with her hands folded and the particular expression of someone who has agreed to be present but has not agreed to participate. He said he had spoken with his attorney. He said the legal situation was complicated, and he respected that I had sought counsel. He said, and I noticed the change in language, that he wanted to make a real offer. He said they would like to purchase the house from me at full market value. He named a number 15% above the current appraisal. He said I would walk away with enough to buy something smaller outright and have money remaining. He said Rachel would be close by. He said the offer was good through the end of the month. It was not a bad offer in financial terms. I want to be honest about that the same way I try to be honest about everything. For approximately 30 seconds, I considered it as a real option, sitting there in my own living room with Robert's bookshelves behind me, and found it genuinely possible to imagine a smaller house, à quitter arrangement, a version of my life that did not include this particular ongoing friction. And then I thought about what accepting the offer would mean. Not just financially. It would mean accepting the premise that Marcus Webb, who had arrived in my house 3 years ago because I had opened it to them in their need, had the right to purchase me out of it when my need for it conflicted with his plans. It would mean accepting that the house where Robert had built shelves and planted azaleas and hung a hook by the door for his canvas jacket was worth approximately what the market said it was worth, and nothing more. It would mean demonstrating to myself and to anyone watching that the right amount of pressure and money could move me out of my own life. I thanked Marcus for the offer. I said I would think about it. Then I called Susan. She said exactly what I expected her to say. Hold the course. An offer that specific means they've assessed the legal situation and they know a civil suit is unlikely to succeed. She paused. They're not offering because they're generous. They're offering because it's cheaper and cleaner than a fight they're likely to lose. If you decline and they file a civil suit anyway, the cognitive evaluation, the certified letter, the advanced documentation, all of it creates a record that is very difficult to argue against. I declined the offer. I sent a written reply through Susan, thanking them and reiterating my position. The month that followed was the hardest. Not because of what Marcus did, but because of what Rachel didn't do. She was present in the house every day, passing me in the hallway, sitting at the kitchen table, watching me with an expression that mixed something like guilt with something like resentment, in a combination I found impossible to respond to. She did not take my side. She did not take his, at least not openly. She occupied the space between us in silence, and the silence was its own kind of statement. There was one evening when I was reading on the back porch, and she came and stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. I looked up at her and waited. She said, "I don't know how we got here." I said, "I do." I said it gently because she was my daughter, and because I believed it was true, and because I thought she needed to hear a true thing said plainly. She went back inside. Susan filed a formal 90-day vacate notice in the first week of December. Not an eviction, but a legal document asserting my right as sole owner to require occupants without tenancy agreements to vacate, with a reasonable timeline. Marcus received it on a Wednesday. I was not in the house when he read it. I was at the library, where I spent 4 hours helping 3 older adults learn how to use the digital catalog system, which I found enormously satisfying. When I came home, Marcus was in the kitchen with his phone and his jaw set in the way of a man who has been told the game is not going the way he planned. He looked at me when I came in. Then he looked away. He said nothing. 2 weeks later, Marcus's attorney sent a letter to Susan formally withdrawing the potential civil action and acknowledging the documentation on file. The letter stated that Marcus and Rachel would vacate the property within the 90-day window. There was no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no apology, no explanation. It was 3 paragraphs, formal and bloodless. Susan called me when she received it and read me the key section over the phone. I sat down at my kitchen table and held the phone and felt the particular quality of silence that follows a long-anticipated thing. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you get your house back," she said simply. They were gone in 67 days. Rachel packed with a methodical grief that was hard to watch. Marcus was efficient and impersonal. On the last morning, he carried boxes past me without speaking, which I found in some ways easier than any conversation we might have had. Rachel stood in the entryway for a moment before she left and looked at the hooks by the door, at Robert's canvas jacket still hanging there, at the heron mat that was back in its place. She said, "I'm sorry, Mom." I think she meant it. I think she has always been better at meaning things than at acting on what she means. I hugged her. I held her for a moment, and I thought about the 8-year-old who stood on a step stool at that kitchen counter learning to roll out biscuit dough, and I loved her with the complete and uncomplicated love that does not require being repaid. And I let her go. Then I closed the door, and I went to the kitchen, and I put the kettle on. Winter came, and then a spring that was gentler than the one before. I had the back porch boards replaced. 3 of them had been soft for 2 seasons, and one April afternoon, I sat out there with coffee and a library book, and the azaleas blooming along the south fence, and felt something in my chest that I recognized as completion. Not happiness exactly, or not only happiness. Something more like the restoration of a right order of things. My financial situation had changed. The mortgage was long paid off, and I had savings, not enormous but steady, and Susan had helped me establish a simple estate plan that made my intentions clear and left no room for the ambiguity Marcus had hoped to exploit. I did not become lavish. I repainted the kitchen the particular yellow I had always wanted. I bought a new armchair for the study that was comfortable. In a way, the old one had stopped being. I started a small fund for the Millhaven Public Library's early literacy program and attended their spring gala for the first time in years. Marcus and Rachel moved to a rental house on the other side of town. The settlement money, I heard through the particular osmosis of a small community, it had been less than they expected after a second round of attorney fees and a tax situation that Marcus apparently had not adequately anticipated. I did not seek information about this. Information simply reached me the way it does in places where people have known each other a long time. Rachel called me in September. I was in the garden when the phone rang. My hands dirty, with the particular good dirt of a fall planting. I looked at her name on the screen, and I sat down on the garden bench that Robert had built the last summer he was well enough to build things. I answered, "Mom." Her voice was careful and tired in a way I recognized from when she was young and had exhausted herself being something she wasn't. "Rachel," I said. She said, "I don't expect you to say it's fine. I don't think it is. But I wanted to call. I wanted to hear your voice." We talked for 45 minutes. Her work, the fall weather, nothing of great consequence. Before she hung up, she asked, "Are you happy there?" I looked at the azalea bushes, bare now and waiting for April, and at the porch with its new boards, and at the kitchen window with the yellow I had always wanted visible from where I sat. "Yes," I said. I meant it completely. We speak now with a different weight than before. Less of obligation, more of choice. What was damaged between us was not the love. What was damaged was the version of our relationship built on my willingness to absorb whatever she brought home and call it family loyalty. The love underneath that was sturdier than I had known while it was being tested. Beverly came for dinner the week Rachel called, and I told her everything over soup and bread that I had made myself in my own kitchen. She listened, and then she said, "You know what Robert would say?" I said, "He'd say the porch boards should have been replaced 2 years ago." Beverly said, "He'd say that, and also that you picked right." I said, "Picked right how?" She smiled. "The heron mat," she said. She meant that I had known which things were worth holding on to. We laughed, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the oak trees along the fence moved in the September wind, and I was in my house, which was mine, entirely and without qualification, which I had not taken for granted since the spring, and did not intend to start again. People say that family is everything, and I believe them. I have simply learned to read the word with more care than I once did. Family is not the people whose names you share, or whose needs you answer without question. Family is the people who see you honestly and return that honesty in kind. It is love that does not require you to make yourself smaller to sustain it. It is Robert's jacket on the hook, and the azaleas he planted, and the books on the shelves he built, and the knowledge, quiet and complete, that none of those things were ever anyone's to take. I planted bulbs in October without being certain I would be at peace to see them bloom. I was there. Whatever it is you are holding on to right now, whatever room someone is trying to convince you that you no longer belong in, I want you to remember something. You know whose name is on the door. Don't let anyone else count on you forgetting. Thank you for being here with me today. I would truly love to know what you thought and what you would have done in my place. Leave a comment, and please, wherever you are, take good care of yourself.